This is No Hate Radio.
I'm no stranger to the rain. Oh, no. I'm no stranger to the rain.
You are listening to the Allendale Equity and Justice Channel. This is No Hate Radio. We are continuing a discussion today that we started. This is kind of the second installment of a discussion about the LGBTQ experience. In fact, we covered a lot of different ground about that, but it was clearly understood, I think, that it's a bigger subject than we were able to cover. And we want to follow up. We want to go forward on that discussion a little bit today. Before I do that, I would like to also kind of establish something about No Hate Radio. No Hate Radio's purpose is to broadcast at the intersection of law, social justice, and public policy. Our mantra is that there are no issues or subjects which are not to be discussed on No Hate Radio except one: hate. We're not going to interject, allow, or have anything to do with hate-based speech. Other than that, this is No Hate Radio for ideas and for exchanges of information, and hopefully to enhance the understanding that people have for other people, and hopefully to reach a point where the intersectionality of law, social justice, and public policy is not such a mismatch. That's the hope on No Hate Radio. Today, we continue with our guest speakers from the last episode on this subject, Reverend David Franks, who, thank you very much for being here, Reverend Franks. We appreciate you. And also Erica George, who is a social worker and works in the field of counseling and dealing with some of the problems that we may hear about and discuss today. And glad to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and with both of you here, one of the things that I want our listeners on No Hate Radio to understand, that my goal here is to enhance an understanding of something that has been almost an issue of political gamesmanship for a very, very long time, and something that the law has been used. Sadly, the law has been used to marginalize and oppress an entire class of humanity. And I think we covered to some extent in our last discussion that we have had a habit in society, and I think American society is where we come from, of understanding that if anyone is different from us or has a different preference, has a different way of living, believes some different set of philosophies or beliefs than we are, that they're inherently bad, and that we have to use the law to do something about that. And I have used, because I'm considerably more familiar with it than I am some other marginalized communities, I have used many times my examples of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the long, long and sordid and miserable history that ultimately gave rise to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And the fact that my personal perception, this is just your lowly host on No Hate Radio's perception, is that were Dr. Martin Luther King here today, he would be sadly disappointed in the lack of progress in that regard. I think much of that can carry over to the discussion of multiple marginalized groups. That's my little intro today. Let me tell you that the people who are sitting here with us today are people who can come from an understanding that is vastly broader, deeper, and higher than mine. And I'll start with you, Reverend Franks. We were discussing at the end of our last session, if you'll remember, that there have been efforts made through some church organizations for reconciliation, for more or less trying to correct an error, or at least go forward. Could you give us your, I guess, perception about that kind of idea, Reverend Franks?
Well, thank you for inviting me back,
Absolutely.
Don. I appreciate being invited back. I think what's happened in the life of the church, whether it's around LGBTQ plus issues and the community and the place we have within the life of the church, is that the church has always struggled. I think from its inception, all the way back to Paul, in terms of including the Gentile, right, into the life of this new movement called Followers of the Way, at that time maybe even the followers of Jesus. So there's always been this struggle to how do we go about including those who have been marginalized, remembering that at one time Israel itself, then and now, has always also understood it as marginalized. And even back then under Judaic law, there were lots of laws that kept those folks marginalized. Okay, so it's kind of not only within our religious tradition, it seems to be also part of the human condition. So with that said, that struggle, that challenge, that call to be more inclusive is one that I think all religious communities have had to stretch in. So when it comes, and even in recent times, in terms of the place of women in leadership roles within the church, a time of, especially then and as now, where women have been marginalized and especially excluded from leadership roles, a real struggle for that to be able to come about. Same thing with people of color, and now also people within the LGBT plus community. Leadership within the religious community of the Christian community is a slow journey, but it's one that does take place, and it actually even lies at the heart of the division that's happening within the United Methodist Church right now, where hundreds, literally hundreds, of United Methodist congregations are, if not have already done so, are in the process of disaffiliating from the United Methodist family. So sometimes those efforts for inclusion actually means times of separation rather than inclusion in an effort to come to some kind of inclusive community. So I think that's a lot of what's been happening. It's part of the human condition, I think, and we, if I have a feeling, once LGBT plus folks feel fully inclusive, there will be another marginalized community with whom we will make great efforts to have them included as well.
So you think that this is probably, at least I took away, my takeaway from your remarks is that all of these marginalized and oppressed communities, they continue to be, that issue continues to present itself in one form or another and is a continuing struggle for the church. And at least I understood from your comments, you think it will continue, regardless of whether it's the LGBTQ plus community or whether it's some other marginalized group.
Yes, and I'm also thinking that it's helpful to be reminded for whoever is the ones who are in control of the power, the ones who are actually making the law, to remember that one day, there was a day in which they too were marginalized. There was a day in which they were oppressed. Remember that there was a time when you lived in the land of Egypt, that there was a time. And so do not become that which you felt yourself oppressed by. Yeah. And it seems to me that part of the example and voice of the church should be one of being a reminder to folks of from where they have come and where they're called to be.
Thank you. And now, Erica, you also deal with this in your world, and could you elaborate on some of those same comments, please, ma'am?
Sure. I think it's interesting because I feel like, of course, I see it kind of in that professional way, but I grew up in the evangelical church as well. Like, was not a Methodist my whole life, but was born kind of Southern Baptist, and so I think kind of seeing those in both ways. But as David was saying, I do think that this so much goes to who we are as people, and even the psychology of people and groups, all the way back of, it's kind of a cliche term that you might hear now, or a kind of a saying, but you say, the quickest way to make, to bind people together is to give them an enemy. And I think that we kind of see that psychological play through society as a whole. I think that you see it in a lot of the fear-mongering and others that's coming, it's not even, you might say intrinsic to who we are as people, like to hate or fearmonger or not understand. I think we're much more prone to kind of do that othering because it cuts us on the inside. You see that all throughout history of wanting to be in the in-group, wanting to be a part of the group that has power, whether or not that's necessarily, you're thinking that, structurally the church, and I would say our country, is built on, a certain type of person, and a certain set of values and a certain way of living, in which case, I would say, heterosexual, male, back we had white, landowning, like those are the people that have made the rules. And so when you are, thinking about how are we moving forward with this, we're clashing against, I would say, humanity's nature for goodness and for inclusion and for wanting to be better. I meet very few people that do not want to be the best versions of themselves, or are not trying to, make the world better in whatever way they believe that to be what they need to be doing. And I would say from the church that a lot of the people who would not allow someone like me to get married in their church or to be a part of their community would still say that they are trying to watch for my soul. They're trying to do what they believe their version of good is. But I think there's this blindness to how close to power, how close to, these structural benefits, what privilege they've taken through, and how they understand sometimes the way the world works, whether you're looking at, within the Christian context of what the Bible says or what the church should be or what Jesus would want, or you're looking secularly of what the laws should be, how we've always done things, what's going to be good for the kids, what's going to be, how should we be raising kids in the next generation so they grow up to be, citizens that are functioning in society, what is going to be good. And I think what we have done is really, in order to keep power, keep things a certain way for the people that have made it to make the rules, we get where the rules keep getting made at the othering of people. And so instead of really being able to live into this big, vision, and so whether you want to say secularly as this, and even within kind of a psychology, social work, we would say individuals kind of go into like a self-actualized version of themselves, like, kind of the best that they can be, that's getting limited by this kind of idea of scarcity. If they have it, then I won't. And, that's not how I was raised. That's not, this is uncomfortable. And so it must be bad. And then I think you get that same struggle just with Christian language and with, I have this conflict about this, or this is hard or dangerous or whatever. That's how that feels. And so this must be God telling me that it's wrong. This must not be what Jesus wants. Like, we need, this is the church the way that it's been. And so this idea of even wanting to be good, wanting to move forward, wanting to be this best version is put in conflict with power, and it's put in conflict with, and like, if we truly change, like, where does that leave all of us?
So you think there's my takeaway there is, and you use the word scarcity. In other words, if you believe that there's only so much good stuff, and that if you're the term is, I think, cisgender. If you're a cisgender white male who has been in the in crowd for a long time, then even if you wanted to say, this has been wrong, and what we need to do is be inclusive, and we need to not set these boundaries and rules, and we need to not marginalize these groups, that there might be just a sort of a internal fear that if I go do that, I'm going to lose. I'm going to lose because someone else gains, and I'm going to lose.
Yeah, and I think that there's that conflict. And again, I think there's, again, a lot of propaganda, a lot of fear-mongering. I think people can get really, really buy into a lot of the really hateful and hurtful things that are said about any marginalized group, including the LGBTQ community. But, I would say as well, I think, you kind of maybe look at the average person that would call themselves, non-affirming is a word that you hear a lot in, and you can use it in both contexts, but specifically in the church context, this idea of, not affirming LGBTQ people, not believing that that's right, not affirming in marriages with a transgender individual. It might not be using a new name, the correct name or the correct pronouns, things like that, like not affirming, who you are in your queer identity. But I think that there's a lot of conflict that comes with that too, because there's so much conflict that comes with any sort of growth. And so I think, and this, not to put you on the spot, but you're someone that I think of a lot in terms of it is so, it's courageous for me to be able to be out and do all of, it's courage in a different way. And it's when I think about someone like you, it's courage that a lot of people don't have to, commit your life and really believe you're doing good in one way, and to realize that in some ways you were incorrect, and to change and to repent for that in whatever context, and move forward in a different way. And I think that that's another thing, is that, so many people too believe that how they treated queer people or a marginalized group was wrong, whether that was for miseducation, whether that, because they didn't know, or whether that's because they believed truly that these people were, harmful to kids or the society, or what we're going against God, like whatever reason they have to stand on that belief. What happens when you do whatever you believed was truly in your convictions, and 20 years later you realized you were wrong, and you have to confront the harm that you caused while trying to do something, like believing that you were doing something good. And I think that conflict is another one that really hold people back from being able to go through it. And I think is one of the reasons you see this kind of racketing back and forth. You see kind of a new generation, and then, you have, some of the same issues, some of the same human, some of that same power and othering. But then you even have people on the other side of that are unwilling to really face, their own actions with a different eye. And so it's a doubling down. And then you would just go even further kind of down an othering way, because it's hard to grow, and it's hard to look at things that you have not done well, or things that you've done that could have harmed people when you didn't mean to. And so, but it definitely presents a choice.
One of the things that you've said, and it does relate to my life experience is that it's an extremely difficult transition to make because it partly requires you to say openly, admit openly, or acknowledge openly, you know what? I've been wrong. I've been wrong. And I've been wrong is a very hard thing for people to say.
Yeah, I was taken by some of the things that that you said, Erica, and to follow up on what you're saying, Don, it seems to me that whenever there is change, meaningful change, it's preceded with the struggle of how do I risk? Do I want to risk? Because the risk says if I am to gain, I risk also losing something. All right? If I am to gain how I view other people, I risk losing some of the people who agreed with me on how I viewed those other people, the marginalized.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And it involves a risk. And in part involved in that risk, I think is, and I find it the most difficult thing, and in my years of experience and doing pastoral counseling and so forth, is the ability or to take the real risk of being able to say, I'm sorry, of really making apology. I know there was at least one couple who came into the life of this congregation for the sign, our marquee, and I remember seeing it too, going like, really? You're really going to put that out there? And what it said was, we are sorry for the harm that we as the church have done to you. You know, powerful
I remember it.
Yeah, powerful statement. Powerful statement. People drove by and went like, "Oh, really?" And I think that was a risk for this church to do that, because there could very well have been people within the church, you know, who would say, "Well, what in the heck do we have to be sorry about? You know, we're the ones who are showing the way." And really, part of the really inherent in the way is knowing truly how to say, I'm sorry. And that sorriness, that apology, actually even has to be saying that to yourself. You know, I'm sorry for the pain I have caused others. And in doing that, I'm now feeling that pain. What a risk that is to get that real with oneself. And yet, I believe that's the seed. It's simply the seed that begins, once planted, allows a person to start stepping out in faith that you will gain more than you will lose in the process.
I think I want to key on that just a little bit, because there's two things about it. And it occurred to me when you were speaking, that it's not only having to say, I have been wrong, but people that I admire greatly have been wrong. My grandfathers, who I admired, respected, and loved, to have to look back and say, you know what? They were wrong. You know, not only was I wrong, but a whole bunch of people around me were wrong. And then the second step, and I believe that this is the core of a lot of what we are going to sit here at No Hate Radio and talk about, not only LGBTQ, but many other issues. If I acknowledge I've been wrong, I have to learn something, don't I? I have to go out and learn what it is that is right, that I can now substitute for what was wrong.
Right, but it's not, I think that's part of it, is to confess,
Yeah.
right? There's that sense of confession in there that said, I've been wrong, but then to apologize for that wrong, and to take that steps that demonstrate that apology. So when it gets to remuneration for those who were once enslaved, to pay amends for that, to show the apology, to show the sorrow for having done the wrong. So the wrong, recognizing the wrong, is definitely absolutely paramount to taking the first steps in that. But then it is about being able to show one's sorrow, being sorry for, and then which then takes the risk of what steps do I take that demonstrate that apology.
One of the things that I recently did, and I'm not saying this to make it about me, but I want to make an example here. I'm trying to learn. My belief is that when you acknowledge that you've been wrong and you're sorry for it and you want to make amends, part of that is to learn what it was you were wrong about, and therefore you have to think. And I think right now in America, thinking is not very popular. But when you think, well, how can I learn? One of the things I have chosen to do is reach out and gain some experience. I went to a meeting of the Trans Network here at the church, and I talked with, it was 40 people. There were a lot of people here in that meeting. And one of the things I had to acknowledge, and I want to tell y'all that it's hard to do when you've been a lawyer, you've been a judge, you've been in a position of power and influence for a long time, to say, I realize, y'all, 40 people that I never met, that my knowledge level of your life and your experiences and your journeys about Ned and a third grade reader, and I would love to get to a high school diploma. And that's an ego buster too, for someone who has been in a position of power and influence. I will say that. And so you got to learn, you got to think, you got to acknowledge some things that haven't been right. And then you got, I think, and I'm seeking y'all's comments on this, then you've got to say, okay, having done all that, there's two themes on No Hate Radio. Why? And what are we going to do about it? So I'm now in the stage of, what are we going to do about it? Now that we've said division and hate and competition and marginalization and oppression and using the law not for the protection but for the harm of the people is wrong, and we're out here learning how life is perceived from among the marginalized population, now what are we going to do about it? So, Erica, I'd like to hand that one off to you.
Yeah, well, I think what's so interesting when we're talking about like that whole process, which I think is so true, rings so well for my, I'll say like kind of deconstruction of how some of the beliefs I held when I, as I grew up around LGBTQ people and things. Just to even, I say that, you know, the reason that I kind of deconstructed this and got to a point that I was willing to do that is because for me, it was that or my life. Like I was faced with an internal reality that was, you know, could not live with the beliefs that I had about, you know, people who I found out didn't know at the time, but were me, in the community that I found myself in. And so I think that, you know, where we're going is I think that first we have to, you know, have that kind of personal stake in the sense of, you know, being very intentional to be with people who are different than you and to be invested. And if we, you know, on the church side of things, if we, you know, are truly believing and living into, you know, we're all members of the same body, what affects, you know, we might be different parts of the body actually, we are different parts of the body, right? You might be an ear, I might be a toe, you might be a hair, whatever. But that what matters to you and your lived experience matters to me in a way that is personal, in a way that it's not just those things that happen to people who are like that. It is part of, your own family, your own body, your own, experience. And I think, of course, in the day-to-day lived experience of how we, are in this world and, the actual lives that we live, I am not actually an ear on your body or, but I think that spiritual idea of really investing into this idea as if it is you and if it affects you, right? And listening and learning. And I think as well as acknowledging that, I think a lot of the conflict too, that I think there is a fear of, well, if I go through all of this and I go through, I understand that maybe the way that the church has treated this marginalized group, insert whether you want to talk about LGBTQ people, women, people of color, whatever we're looking at through history and will look at in the future.
Add immigrants to that.
Absolutely. If I want to, if I sit here and I go through that and I realize that, it's all wrapped up as well in who I believe, my faith and Jesus and salvation, all of these concepts. But what you're saying I really resonated with is not only you're wrong, but the people that you've admired, the people that you've sought for years and sat under for spiritual teaching. If those people are wrong, where else am I wrong? And I think that is maybe even more than, the issue at hand, which would be, am I wrong about LGBTQ inclusion in the church? Am I wrong with what is biblical? Am I wrong? How, is there a different way of understanding this that is more in line with the person and spirit of Jesus? That's one question. But to then go and say, but if that's true, then what about these other 20 things? And so I think that there's also, a willingness to start investigating, your beliefs and being willing that, if you want to think of your beliefs as bricks on a wall, that you might not just be talking about this one brick, if that falls, other things and other ways and beliefs, it may fall, and that's okay. And it can be rebuilt and be built in a way that I believe is more in tune with who the church and is being called to be, and the movement of the Spirit and the person and life of Jesus as we read about. And so it's kind of a big picture answer, but I think, of course you have things like, you have where do we go, where we have, things like advocating and standing in solidarity and, against laws or against, exclusion in the church. You have aligning yourself with people in these experiences. But I think even, that's kind of the individual actions. But I think there's a big picture of being willing to be wrong, even not about this, and knowing that is okay. And that, that in order to be who, God is calling you to be, that there is this rebirth where the church and Christianity is built so much into being saved again and rebirth and these concepts. But I think so much of us get saved and then we tighten all of how we felt about how we were taught and exactly about that right now, because then that's like we arrived, we did it. Where instead I think it's much more fluid and it's much more liberating than that. You're shackling yourself if you're then unwilling to change from, say the day of conversion, and to think that there is not so many other things that, God's wanting to do in you and wanting to do through the people that and the inclusion and community and liberation that can happen when we really embrace that.
One of the things that occurs to me, and those who know me know that song lines, I guess I live by song lines. If it wasn't for song lines, I probably couldn't talk. But one of my most favorite singer-songwriters was Chris Christopherson, and it reminds me of some lines out of a song he wrote called Why Me, Lord? And where we've all been trained kind of more or less buttonholed into a notion of a visual picture let's say those of us who want to connect with the church, want to connect with religion, we have been buttonholed into this vision of Jesus as basically as a white man, usually tall, very stately looking, and I remember, it may not seem like a big deal now, but
he looks gay.
Well, he looks like the pastor of the churches that image is in.
But what made me think of it as you were talking, Christofferson is a wordsmith of the first order, and one of the things he said in one of his songs was, Jesus was a Capricorn, he ate organic food, he had long hair and sandals and a funky bunch of friends. Now, if you're
That does sound gay.
now, if you're a person who has been steeped in the very traditional ideas, visualizations, notions of who we are following when we are saying, I'm a Christian, or I'm a member of this church, I believe in the Holy Trinity, or whatever you say, whatever your mantra is. Sometimes it occurs to me that if you don't get out of that box, you're never really going to understand at any level other than superficial what that all means.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. You asked the question, so what are we going to do? Yeah. Okay. I think I so appreciate your sharing about going to the trans dialogue group kind of thing to learn, and I think one of the first areas that we begin to do something is taking that risk of exposing ourselves to that which makes us uncomfortable. All right? That's all of a sudden I just had a flashback to when I was in high school. I went on a church tour kind of thing, a 2-week tour that exposed me. It's what helped me know my call into ministry, quite truthfully, where I was raised, in the San Fernando Valley, in a little town called Granada Hills in Southern California, in white suburbia, yeah. And this church bus tour, United Methodist, exposed me literally to all different kinds of cultures and what was happening. This is back in 1969. And so all of a sudden I was, in the black community meeting with the Black Panthers. I was in the Latino, Chicano community of East LA, speaking with La Raza and hearing what they had to say about my upbringing and where I lived, and how that impacted their lives. Going in and meeting with sex workers in Las Vegas, and then from there going and meeting with people who were in like SNFs, skilled nursing facilities, low income, all of these exposures. It was like, oh my gosh, there's another world out there. There's another people. And so I think one of the first things we do is we need to strategize on ways in which we help people take that risk to expose themselves to the lives of others. It's one of my concerns, quite truthfully, with people, such a large percentage of people working at home, and creating these individual silos without being in a work environment where they're having to be exposed to other people of ethnic background, sexual orientations, gender identities, all of that. I mean, you can get so much, on the internet and thinking you're exposed, but it's not until you really hear and become in relationship to another person, and there's a relational thing there that is created that helps you then to identify in yourself, what am I about? And what am I called to do? And what risks am I to take? So that's one of my concerns right there, is I think one of the things we need to do is create opportunities for people to get out of their silos. And I think that's one of the calls that Allendale United Methodist Church is about, is to create those kinds of opportunities. So I think that's one thing we do. I'm also clear then that we also teach people how to listen, to create those environments. Listening can also be something of a skill. It's not there just to confirm what you already believe. Find the places of agreement. And just one more thing, I think what we also do, what are we doing next, is to really take a look at those laws that help to promote diversity and ways of people interacting. I am totally convinced, and I'll just say this one last thing, I'm totally convinced that we here in the United States, if we can get it right, then in terms of how we live with such diversity and culture in this country, if we can get it right here, then there might be a chance for the world. Because the world is a different place. It really has its own, each country has, whether it's Ireland or Belgium or Australia or Africa or South Africa, wherever it is, where populations seem to be a bit more homogeneous. If we can get it right in the United States, where we are so diverse, I can't think of a more diverse country in the world than here in the United States. If we can get it right here, we're the testing ground. If we can get it here, I think it models, it shows the way, and I think it's part of what democracy is about, truthfully, and why we're on ice right now, is if we're able to do it here, then the world may have a chance. Otherwise, I think we'll just be at war.
That's very insightful, and I'm serious in saying that. It's very insightful. Erica, do you have another comment on that?
I was just going to say, I really like what you said about taking that risk and being very intentional to be exposed, to different people. But I think even the other coin, the other side of that coin is to go into those spaces not assuming that you're right. Because I think that's how you get kind of the cliches that, I have a gay friend. I have a black friend. I have where it's these people that but that and sort of whether, and I think it comes from a lot of places, I think, and it comes from, wanting to just believe your way is the right, way, that very human idea, but it also comes from things like societal power and things of like if the rules have been made by people like you, then if you see someone, approaching life, approaching God, approaching things differently, then not only is that a risk in and of itself to form that relationship, even more of a risk and even a different form of vulnerability and courage to say, and I could be the one, I'm not walking into it being like, that's so weird, almost as if we're observing, at a zoo, like, oh, that's so interesting, but I'm going to go and do whatever. Like, I just want to see what everyone's up to, but not actually interact. It's really that vulnerability and kind of a very small almost example I think about when I married my wife, and I realized even though we grew up from, very similarly, like background wise, we have very different Christmas traditions. And so she's, baking boxes for cookies for everyone. They did stockings. We hung stockings. We didn't put anything in them. I did, we did the Happy Birthday Jesus cake on Christmas morning. She makes like very different. And so even in doing that of like such a small example, but imagine what indicative of a bigger problem it would be if one of us came into that marriage and that conversation, our first, serious Christmas together, and said, okay, well, what does Christmas look like in the George household?
Yeah.
And I said, well, we did it this way, and that's how we're going to do it, because clearly my family did Christmas correctly.
Yeah, it was the right thing
instead of finding where now it's, well, we do stockings on Christmas Eve because that's what they did, but we do the birthday cake to Jesus on Christmas morning first thing, but then we eat the sausage balls that her family, it's such a mishmash now of how we both grew up in a way that is so beautiful and meaningful. And then, we'll pass that on to our kids, hopefully, and they won't know, well, that's what my one mom did and that's what my other mom did. This is just a new way and a new tradition that brings in good parts of both of how we grew up. And that's such a small, low stakes example. But I just do think of the, respect and equality, even small conversations like that in a marriage take when you're building the kind of family, kind of future you want to build together. And I think when I think of the church, I think about that. But we're having conversations that have 500, an infinitesimal more amount of really importance and significance, but so many people are coming to the table with, well, I'm right, but I'd love to hear your input. So then that way, you're here, but really not being respected and included and having things shift and change in any sort of meaningful way. And I think that's what we really have to
when
think
you
about
go
as well.
in to that world that you haven't been a part of, and I'll make a personal example out of this. It's like being at that Trans Network meeting. I was not the knowledgeable person in that meeting. I was the learner. I was the Ned in the third grade reader. I was the kid. Now, I told you all I wasn't going to do much talking, but I have one thing that keys in on all this, and it really covers some of the feelings and I think some of the attitudes that you both have discussed, and it occurred to me during this conversation. A while ago now, a couple of decades ago, I was on a commission in the state of Texas called Intergovernmental Relations, and one of the things we did is we would go out in counties where they were having some kind of trouble or another. And one of the places we went was just outside El Paso County, where a lot of land had been sold by unscrupulous people who sold it to Spanish-speaking individuals who mostly didn't speak English at all or very broken English, and they sold it to them on what's called contracts for deed. Anyway, a miserable and really oppressive and worse than oppressive, exploitive kind of way. And they sold it to them and they didn't put in any infrastructure, like no sewer, no roads, no nothing, and the people were basically living in third world conditions. And as the chair of that commission, I was there in El Paso County, and I was talking to the commissioners, and then I went down on a fact-finding mission down into these areas. And they were called the colonias. That was a term that was used for all of these so-called subdivisions. And I'll never forget this. And now, many years later, as I look back on it, I thought to myself, why did you not have the courage? Because here's what happened. I was driving this black Chevrolet Suburban with these gold seals on the door that said the state of Texas and all of that. And I drove into this colonias, really not on much of a road, but I drove in there, and I saw these people living in squalid circumstances. I knew they had been taken major advantage of. I knew they had been lied to, cheated on, and stolen from. And as I drove by them and looked at them, and they looked at me, and I suspect they thought, this guy's from outer space. who is this guy? Driving down here in this fancy car, looking at us like this. And at that time, I drove through that Colonius and out another road and down into another Colonius and back out, back up the highway and all. I never talked to one of them.
Did you get out of the car at all?
No.
Yeah.
No. I didn't even get out of the car. So you had mentioned when you go into an area, unfamiliar, something that isn't your experience, isn't your life experience, you can come from it one of two ways. You can be like me telling this trans group, hey, I'm Ned and a third grade reader. I'm here to learn. Teach me something about your life experience and really mean it. Or you can be the guy in the suit in the black Suburban with the gold seals on the doors that looks at him like somebody in a zoo. Takes courage to get out of the car.
Yeah. And of course, my follow-up question to you is what kept you in the car?
Probably attitudes of them and us.
Were you afraid of him?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't recall a feeling of fear, but I recall a definite feeling of estrangement. Mm-hmm. I didn't see them. I saw them as this macro social problem that I was supposed to do something about. Mm-hmm. What I didn't see
people
were see them as people.
Yeah.
And
fascinating.
And when I went back in that shiny black Suburban to downtown El Paso and climbed on an airliner and flew back to Austin, my life went back to where it was. Sadly, so did theirs. I share that to tell you that I do have an understanding of the difference in the way people approach the reach out, the try to enter the world of, be a part of. I remember when I was running for office, for judicial office in Texas, one of the things I always did, we had churches, AME churches, African Methodist Episcopal churches, and we had Southern Baptist African American churches. And when I would come in to introduce myself and try and encourage people to vote for me and things like that, I always stood at the back of the church until the pastor invited me into the church. And I was told later that one of the reasons that I did obtain some support from minority communities in my county was because I was the only one that showed the respect. It's all about the attitude you bring when you come into and try to learn about, even acknowledging that maybe you've been wrong, or even being the great white father trying to fix the problem for the colonialist dwellers. You're not going to get there. My opinion, this is IMHO for anybody listening. In my humble opinion, you're not going to get anywhere until those folks become your people. Then you're going to get somewhere. And final comments, Erica?
No, I mean, I think this is a really good conversation, and I think that, you know, I think that when you're thinking about inclusion, you know, and the LGBTQ people place in the church, as well as, you know, society and the way that these conversations play out in the public sphere, I think that we can get so caught in the little weeds of, well, what does and they're important conversations to have in maybe another, in a deeper form, right? But like, you're probably never going to convince someone, off of, well, people also think that this Greek word is translated, this way. It's a very important, to have the, I would say the biblical scholarship for LGBTQ inclusion in the church. And, that's something David and I have done a lot of work with together and taught classes about. But I think that, if you're where people are coming from, right, their internal, their beliefs about themselves, other people, that to start there and to start with courage and empathy and curiosity, that these are the starting places to create change and have these conversations, that not everyone needs to be able to, have a master's level understanding of, what it says in the original Hebrew to know, where the church needs to go, or to know that LGBTQ people are just as important to the body of Christ as they are. And I think that's not that, you can sit in a pew and give any church money, for the most part. I'll say that's my experience. They have no problem if you come sneak in the back row and give them money, but, you're not going to be on the stage serving. You're not going to be able to use your gifts and your time. You're not going to be given the mutuality or the respect of another person who is part of this community.
Unless you got a reconciling church.
Yes, but I think that is where the church, that is where the church is going. But in this whole conversation of, what does that look like now? Why are we having this, movement now? What are some of the things that are different about places that have been able to do inclusion really well, like Allendale? Like, what is the difference? Is it because it's just full of academic scholars, or is it just full of, people that have just really figured it out, or grew up just the right way, or come from the same place? I think it's, the exact opposite. It's full of individuals, whether you're a part of the marginalized community or not a part of that community, who are coming to the table with curiosity and empathy and willingness to be wrong and be courageous and to interrogate and investigate why they have believed what they've believed up to that point of interaction. And so I think that this is how the Spirit is moving. I think that it is in inclusion, and I really truly believe it is the next great movement of the church. And we will be able to look back as this time in history as when we stopped squashing and silencing the Spirit that was so trying to move in the church to have this inclusion of the LGBTQ part of the body that has been there the whole time, but has not been able to use their gifts and bring what they needed to bring to the body. And so that's kind of what my thoughts are.
Your optimism is contagious. David, final comments.
Yeah, in my first pastorate, I had one of my mentors said to me one time, and I've always taken it to heart and I've used it, and it is this, that if you want to create change, and this would be like in the local congregation, my first parish, you're at a board meeting, and you want to move this church forward. He said, don't make a statement, ask a question. That's where change begins. Don't pontificate, but rather listen. Ask a question that gets at the change you want to see brought about. And so I want to thank you, Don, for inviting Erica and myself, and to have done so by asking questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, both of you. It's very, very important that you've both been here and that we've had these sessions, because the whole idea is to understand people as people and to eliminate as I think Erica used the term, the othering of people. we need to do something about that. People like me need to develop courage. They need to develop courage. And I hope that Erica's optimistic view for the future in the church is right. Like I said, her optimism is contagious. I'll say this, that we are benefited greatly by the perspective that you two have added to the discussions on No Hate Radio. Hopefully in another day you can come back and discuss another subject or another topic with us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Y'all have a great day. Thank you for listening to our broadcast today. We appreciate your interest and invite your input either by calling our message line at 442-4-NO-HATE and leave us your thoughts, comments, ideas, or suggestions, or send us an email by using the email link on our website, or directly email us at nohateradio@allendaleequityjustice.com.